Hello everyone. Today's topic is the Crusades, a very complicated period with a lot of specifics that we won't have a chance to get into. But I started with this picture because I think it gives us a nutshell view of what most people think the Crusades are all about. And it looks like there are two armies in armed combat here, jousting at each other, carrying lances. And this is a 14th century painting from a French manuscript. But there's a lot more to the Crusades than just the fighting, and it's a highly political and highly emotional period. I'm going to start by doing something kind of strange, which is talk about pilgrimage. We have a stereotype that medieval people did not move around very much, and in general, that's true, especially if you're a poor person who is stuck to the land that you live on. But for people who were middle to upper class, it was possible from about the 4th century on to travel to particular holy sites, to pay respects to saints, and hopefully to gain some kind of spiritual benefit. It starts in the 4th century because it begins with Constantine building various churches in Jerusalem. And during that period, since the Roman Empire is still an empire, it's relatively straightforward to be able to travel from someplace like Rome to someplace like Constantinople. Of course, that gets interrupted during the period when there are so many new groups migrating into the Roman Empire. It makes it impossible to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem until much later. But there were many major pilgrimage sites in Europe. One of the most famous, apart from Rome, is Santiago de Compostela in Spain. This Spanish cathedral believed to have the bones of the Apostle James, so very important body of somebody who was very close to Jesus during his lifetime. And people came from all around to go to Spain, go to Santiago de Compostela, and to pay their respects to the bones there. After the martyrdom of Thomas Becket, which is something we haven't talked about quite yet, but I want to mention Canterbury. If you've had to read the Canterbury Tales, which I imagine many of you had to read in high school, you will recognize Canterbury as a major pilgrimage site in England. Of course, Rome is also a major pilgrimage site for people who want to visit the relics of the apostles Peter and Paul in the cathedral in Rome. And of course, Jerusalem, after the Carolingian period, it is possible again to travel to Jerusalem. And some very prominent upper class people make these kinds of pilgrimages. Now, the reason that I'm talking about pilgrimage before I talk about the Crusades is I want you to understand that there were people moving back and forth between Europe and the Near East all the way through our period with a few stoppages along the way. It was a very dangerous thing to do. It took a long time, particularly if you went overland as opposed to taking a ship. And sailing on the Mediterranean Sea was very dangerous. There were hostile ships, there were pirates in the Mediterranean, and there were storms that could knock over your boat, and it generally was a very, very harrowing trip. So I want you to understand that, and I also want you to understand that when the Crusade is first called in the year 1095, that's when the whole thing begins. It's constituted in the same way as a pilgrimage, and indeed some of the people who went on the Crusade regarded it as a form of pilgrimage. Just to give you an idea, this is a map of Europe showing the various different ways that people made their way to Santiago de Compostela, which is over here. And these are called the Chemin de Saint-Jacques, or the Ways of St. James. Right? You see, you could take a ship all the way from Plymouth to Saint-Jacques de Compostela. You could also go across to France and make your way overland down from there. You could come from southern France or from Rome by coming overland through Arles. Up here, you can see the symbol of St. James. That is a scallop shell, which is the symbol of pilgrimage, particularly to Compostela. Okay, so having talked a bit about pilgrimage, let's talk about crusading. Between 1095 and 1350, there are 8 official crusades. That is, there are 8 times when the papacy issued a formal call to crusade. But as we'll talk about later, it doesn't stop. There are not crusades and then no movement, and crusade and no movement, but rather there's a constant stream of people going back and forth between Europe and the Near East. So what we're going to talk about today is the First Crusade. I need to emphasize that in the First Crusade, there are multiple interests at work. Multiple Muslim rulers of different ethnicities. And this is key to understanding what's going on in Jerusalem at this point. Multiple Christian rulers, including the Pope, the kings of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, and the Byzantine Emperor as well. And along with it comes a series of east-west invasions from Asia. So the Muslim world is actually invaded from 2 sides at once in the 11th century, a Turkish invasion from the east and then a European invasion from the west. Okay, so let's remember what the world of Islam looks like at this point. So people are coming down. They generally tend to come down here. You can take a ship all the way to the port near Damascus. You can come overland like this. Right? Now, at the point that we're talking about, Egypt and Syria and part of what's now Turkey had been overwhelmed by a people called the Seljuk Turks. We can talk more about them in class if you want to, in the 1070s. And after that happened, the crusade begins in the 1090s. Here is the only picture that any manuscript gives us of the Emperor Alexius Comnenus. You can see his dates there. And the crusade began actually with a letter from Alexius to Pope Urban II. Now you might remember that in 1054, the 2 churches had excommunicated each other. And that excommunication was still in force. So relations were not friendly between the Roman Church and the Greek Church. But Alexius was worried about the spread of Muslim control in his region. And so he sent a letter to Pope Urban asking for military aid to be sent. Now, what Alexius seems to have wanted was some military forces, probably mercenaries, that he could employ and then send home in order to defend himself from the spread of the Turks from just to his east. But Pope Urban wanted more influence in the Byzantine Church and was hoping to bring the churches back together. So he did something that the emperor was not expecting. He began to preach a crusade. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, he gave a speech. There are many different versions of that speech. We're going to talk about what one of them in class. And he promised the people who went on crusade what's called a plenary indulgence. The word plenary means altogether. Right? So a plenary indulgence is a promise that if you go on crusade and you die on the way, that all your sins will be forgiven you. And this was a very attractive proposition for some people in Europe. So this is to show you the kind of pressure that the Byzantine Empire was under. So this is Turkish territory here, and it's most of what's now Turkey in Asia Minor. And you can see that there's a long front here and a good press in the direction of Constantinople. So this is why he was so worried. Now, Urban knew that it was going to take a little while to get together the official crusade because it had to be called, it had to be recruited, it had to be organized, the supply chains had to be put together. And so it wasn't until 1096 that the Crusaders actually got on their way. Before that, something very strange happened. In 1095 and 6, a group of peasants, many thousands strong, came out of Upper Europe and Germany wanting to crusade for themselves. They were led by some knights and a particular preacher, and they headed down through Germany in the direction of Constantinople. This is a crazy story, and we can talk more about it in class if you want to. But basically, as they went, they didn't take any supplies with them, so they had to scavenge and forage off the land to get enough to eat. And in doing so, they sacked several German cities, Mainz and Worms and a couple of other places. And there they destroyed Jewish communities, reasoning that if they were going to kill unbelievers anyway, they should start with Jews. This is a very, very difficult period to be a Jew in European history. It's not like there are many easy ones. We'll talk more about Jews next time. The historian Anna Komnena, who was the daughter of Alexius Komnenos, the emperor, wrote a source which tells of their arrival. She looked down off the walls of Constantinople and saw this ragtag band of people, many, many thousands strong, and was appalled. She could not believe that this ragtag band had made it all the way from Germany. Alexius didn't really know what to do with them, and so he ferried them across the Strait of the Bosphorus and put them into eastern Greek territory so that they could attack the Muslims. At this point, the Peasants' Crusade broke into two groups, one which was German and one which was French, and they began rampaging around the area, sacking some cities which turned out to be Greek Orthodox cities. And finally, a Muslim army came up from the east and wiped them out. So it's a really, really sad story of people who perhaps started well and ended badly. I'm not sure how to characterize the Peasants' Crusade, except as a sort of a sad tragedy. Now, the real Crusaders, if you want to use the word real, the Crusaders that had been assembled by the Pope, arrived in 1096, and this was what Alexius Comnenus had been expecting. He wanted an army from the west to help him fight the Muslims. But the army that turned up outside the walls of Constantinople was not particularly interested in obeying the emperor, and they had a very strange relationship. The people coming from the west wanted Alexius Comnenus to promise them, if they got any territory, that he would reimburse them for the territory that they got. They finally got entered in an agreement, but it fell apart quite quickly. As soon as the Crusaders got across into Asia Minor, they had the excuse to strike out on their own because they thought that he was not fulfilling his part of the bargain. All right, here's a map from 1110. So you might remember the way the Byzantine Empire looked in our last area. So Byzantine and crusading forces have now taken the coast. And then, once the Crusaders struck out on their own, these are what's called the Latin kingdoms, or the Outremer, which is a word that I'll spell for you in class. These are the little kingdoms and principalities that form as the Crusaders press south in the direction of Jerusalem. Now, I want you to look at these little kingdoms and notice how much border they have with hostile forces. So they are sandwiched between the Mediterranean, which is, of course, a really good position to be in if you need supplies, for example. But they're sort of squashed up against the Mediterranean, either by the Seljuk Turks or by the Fatimids up out of Egypt. And there's the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They got Jerusalem in 1099. It was a terrible slaughter. The effects of Crusades were, first of all, increased power for the popes. And a foundational event of the 11th and 12th centuries is the beginning of the expansion of papal power. So we're going to talk a lot more about that in this class. More of the concept of holy war. Some very interesting new orders of monks, which are known as the military orders. You may have heard of the Knights Templar and the Knights of St. John. These are men who maintain their military status while following most of the rules of monks. They are first constituted to either protect people who are coming on pilgrimage through the Holy Land, or they are in charge of one of the many hospitals that populate that area. The Knights of St. John are sometimes called the Knights Hospitaller because they take care of hospitals. Each of the Crusades affects home politics because the kings and the nobles are absent, and this happens periodically. And then I want to emphasize one more time that travel back and forth to Jerusalem becomes more normalized. So people are coming and going between Jerusalem and Europe constantly during the crusading period. We're going to talk some about votive stuff in class.